Berlin, Germany, 1943. German intelligence officers gathered around a table covered with deformed shell casings. Every single one had been recovered from destroyed panzer tanks on the Eastern Front. And none of them matched any known Allied ammunition specifications. The metal had punched through hardened armor like wet cardboard, leaving clean holes that defied all metallurgical logic. One technician held a fragment under the light and frowned. The chemical residue inside looked strange, organic, almost biological. It wasn't standard cordite. It wasn't TNT. It was something no German manual had predicted. And this ignorance was costing lives in every battle from Kursk to the Ukrainian steppes. How could a projectile designed with materials considered human waste outperform ammunition made with the most refined and expensive explosives in the war industry? The answer wasn't in elite laboratories of major American corporations or European military research institutes. It was in a small brick building on the outskirts of Baltimore, Maryland, where a chemist considered too erratic for the regular army was experimenting with compounds other scientists would have dismissed as disgusting or useless. His name was George Kistiakowsky, a Ukrainian immigrant with a Princeton Ph.D. and a reputation for ignoring safety rules, institutional protocols, and his superiors' opinions. They called him the Mad Chemist, not for clinical insanity, but for his willingness to try anything, no matter how absurd it seemed on paper. Before Kistiakowsky picked up a laboratory flask filled with crystallized urea derived from processed human urine and mixed it with ammonium nitrate in a ratio that had never been officially documented, the world of military explosives operated under rigid principles established since World War I. Smokeless powder, invented in the 1880s, had dominated ammunition for half a century. High-yield explosives like TNT, RDX, and nitroglycerin were mass-produced in factories that consumed tons of toluene, cotton, and nitric acid, all strategic materials controlled by governments and industrial cartels. Every shell, every bomb, every depth charge depended on long, expensive supply chains vulnerable to sabotage or blockades. The first experiment was conducted in a metal shed behind his laboratory in April 1943. Kistiakowsky mixed purified urea with ammonium nitrate in a 60-40 ratio. He added a plasticizer to keep the mixture stable and compressed it into a cylindrical mold the size of a 75mm artillery cartridge. The resulting compound was white, granulated, and surprisingly dense. He called it Compound 3s, a name designed to reveal nothing about its origin. There were no safety protocols for what he was doing. No manuals describing how to handle explosives based on organic waste. He placed the cylinder in an armored test chamber, connected an electrical detonator, and retreated behind a concrete barrier. He pressed the switch. The explosion shook the shed walls, lifted dust from the floor, and left a 20-centimeter crater in the iron plate used as a target. The detonation velocity was 7,200 meters per second, comparable to standard TNT. The impact pressure had pierced hardened iron without fragmenting. Kistiakowsky reviewed the data 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. It had worked. Kistiakowsky contacted the U.S. Army Artillery Department and requested a field test at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, in June 1943. Military officers arrived with visible skepticism. They examined the white cylinders Kistiakowsky had brought in wooden crates and asked if he really expected these soap borers to compete with military-grade ammunition. One general picked up a cylinder in his hands, squeezed it, and frowned. It was lighter than an equivalent TNT projectile, which according to all military doctrine meant less power. "Dr. Kistiakowsky," he said in a condescending tone, "we've been manufacturing ammunition for 4 years of war. What makes you think an experimental compound can surpass decades of industrial experience?" Kistiakowsky looked the general directly in the eyes. "Because you've never tried this." On the morning of the test, dawn broke cold and humid. Kistiakowsky arrived early, personally examined each of his experimental projectiles, and supervised loading into test cannons. At 9 in the morning, with a dozen high-ranking officers watching from a safe distance, Kistiakowsky loaded the first A3 projectile into an M1 field gun. He aimed at a captured German armor plate from a Panzer IV tank, positioned 200 meters away. Kistiakowsky adjusted the gun's elevation, checked ballistic calculations, and ordered fire. The projectile left the cannon with a dry blast, less dramatic than standard ammunition but just as fast. It crossed the distance in a fraction of a second and struck the armor with an impact that echoed across the entire testing ground. When the smoke dissipated, officers walked to the target in silence. What they saw left them speechless. The projectile had pierced the 80mm armor cleanly, leaving a perfectly circular hole, and had exited the other side before exploding against the sand berm behind the target. There were no radial cracks around the impact point. No middle deformation. The armor had been perforated as if it were wood. One colonel took off his cap, crouched to examine the hull up close, and said quietly, "What the hell is this?" Kistiakowsky, standing a few meters away with his hands in his pockets, smiled for the first time in weeks. "Processed urine and cheap nitrate," he replied. Mass production of compound A3 began in August 1943 at a converted chemical plant in Wilmington, Delaware. The process was surprisingly simple compared to TNT manufacturing. Urea was obtained as a byproduct of the fertilizer industry, where it was already produced in large quantities for agricultural use. It didn't require toluene or concentrated sulfuric acid, the two main bottlenecks of conventional explosive production. The plant manager, a chemical engineer named Robert Chambers who had spent 20 years making TNT, was amazed by the process efficiency. With TNT, he explained in an internal report, we need to heat toluene to 80 degrees Celsius, slowly add nitric acid to avoid violent reactions, keep the mixture stirring for 6 hours, cool it gradually, wash it 3 times to eliminate acid residues, and finally dry it in special ovens. The entire process takes 3 days and consumes enormous amounts of energy. With A3, we mix 2 dry powders, press them into molds, and they're ready in 4 hours. No excessive heat, no dangerous acids, no toxic fumes. It's almost ridiculously simple. The cost per kilogram dropped from $2.40 for TNT to 85 cents for A3, a reduction of almost 65%. The first shipments of A3 ammunition were sent to the European front in October 1943, just in time for the Italian campaign. American gunners received minimal instructions, use it like standard ammunition, but expect better penetration. They weren't told what made it different. They weren't told where it came from. They weren't told they were firing projectiles whose explosive had begun as metabolic waste. Reinforced concrete bunkers that had withstood days of continuous bombardment with conventional ammunition now collapsed after 3 or 4 direct hits. German Panther tanks, with their 100mm sloped frontal armor designed specifically to deflect Allied projectiles, began to be penetrated at distances over 1,000 meters, something previously only possible with specialized anti-tank guns or dive bombers. German tank crews sent frantic reports to their commanders, new type of enemy ammunition, inexplicable penetration, urgent analysis requested. One artillery lieutenant named James Morrison wrote in his personal diary, something changed with the ammunition. I don't know what. The projectiles sound different when they explode, as if the air itself is breaking. The Germans are dying faster. Nobody talks about it, but we all feel it. German intelligence was desperate to understand what had changed. They captured unexploded projectiles on the battlefield, carefully packed them in padded crates, and sent them by armored train to analysis laboratories in Berlin. German technicians, among the world's most sophisticated military chemists, began dismantling captured projectiles with surgical precision. They photographed every component. They weighed every fragment. They analyzed chemical composition using mass spectrometry and chromatography. A document marked Top Secret speculated, the Americans appear to have incorporated nitrogenous organic compounds into their explosive formulation. The presence of urea suggests they're using industrial or agricultural byproducts. It's possible they found a way to stabilize these compounds for military use. But that investigation never materialized. The Germans were trapped in their own chemical orthodoxy, convinced that high-purity explosives were superior by definition. The idea that something as dirty as a waste derivative could outperform their refined explosives was incompatible with their philosophy of warfare. They never arrived at the right answer because they could never imagine anyone would try something so unconventional. The impact of Compound 3 would be on the battlefield. It changed how the Allies thought about logistics and war production. Before E3, every shell fired represented a significant investment in scarce raw materials. If German submarines sank a convoy transporting toluene from Texas to munitions plants in New Jersey, ammunition production dropped for weeks. E3 broke this dependency radically. Urea could be produced locally in any country with a fertilizer industry, and the United States had one of the largest in the world. Military economists calculated that adoption of E3 had freed approximately 40,000 tons of toluene for other strategic uses, mainly aviation fuel and synthetic rubber production. During the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German counteroffensive on the Western Front, American units equipped with E3 projectiles fired an average of 340 rounds per day per gun, compared to 180 rounds per day for units still using standard TNT ammunition. The difference wasn't that soldiers fired faster or had more guns. It was that they could afford to do so without exhausting their reserves. The Germans, in contrast, depended on high-precision ammunition manufactured with slow and expensive chemical processes inherited from the previous industrial era. By 1945, German units on the Western Front were sometimes limited to 10 shells per gun per day, 1/10 of what their American counterparts were firing. It wasn't just that Allied ammunition was better in terms of penetration, there was so much more of it, and that abundance was itself a strategic weapon as powerful as any tank or bomber. George Kistiakowsky never sought fame for his invention. After the war, he returned to academia, taught physical chemistry at Harvard, and worked as a scientific advisor to American presidents during the 1950s and 1960s. He rarely spoke about Compound 3 in public, and when he did, he described it as an experiment of convenience rather than a revolutionary breakthrough. In his memoirs, published in 1976, he wrote, "I didn't invent an explosive. I simply stopped ignoring the obvious. Nitrogen is everywhere. You just need to know where to look for it." That modesty concealed the true magnitude of his contribution. Without E3, the Allied campaign in Italy would have lasted months longer. The battle for France would have consumed more lives. Ammunition production would have continued being a strategic bottleneck until the war's end. Kistiakowsky didn't just create an explosive, he created a logistical advantage that allowed the Allies to fight on multiple fronts without running out of ammunition. The final irony of Compound 3 is that the Germans had access to the same materials throughout the entire war. Urea was available in Germany. Ammonium nitrate was produced in their own factories. German chemists, trained in rigid academic traditions, never considered that something as dirty as a metabolic byproduct could be used in precision ammunition. Their military doctrine emphasized material purity, process perfection, technical superiority as a reflection of ideological superiority. While the Germans refined their TNT to 99.8% purity, the Americans were mixing fertilizer with urine and winning the war one projectile at a time. The lesson of Compound 3 isn't that simple technology beats advanced technology. The lesson is more subtle and more important. Closed systems eventually collapse under the weight of their own orthodoxy. The German explosive industry was technically superior in almost every measurable aspect. Their chemists were better trained, their factories were more modern, their purity standards were higher. But all that excellence was built on fundamental assumptions no one dared question. They assumed military explosives should come from complex chemical processes. They assumed power required rare and expensive materials. They assumed what worked in 1918 would work in 1943. These assumptions blinded them to alternatives that were literally under their feet in the waste products of their own industries and bodies. The building where Kistiakowsky conducted his first experiments with urea still exists, though it's now an auto parts warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore. There's no commemorative plaque, no monument. The employees working there don't know that the concrete floor beneath their feet once shook with explosions that would change modern military history. The story of the mad chemist who mixed urine with gunpowder doesn't appear in school textbooks or popular documentaries. It's been forgotten, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too strange, too prosaic, too embarrassing to fit into heroic narratives of war. But the veterans who fired those white projectiles in Italy, France, and Germany knew the truth. They knew that every time they pulled the firing cord of an M1 gun and watched German armor disintegrate, they were witnessing something extraordinary. They didn't know it came from urine. They didn't know it had been invented by a Ukrainian immigrant who refused to follow the rules. And in a war where the difference between victory and defeat was measured in shells per minute, that was enough. Between 1943 and 1945, over 40% of all artillery ammunition fired by the U.S. Army in Europe contained some variant of compound A3. That's millions of projectiles, tens of thousands of tons of explosives, and a fundamental change in how battles were fought. The mad chemist mixed human waste with gunpowder and changed the world. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places.